Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
My guest truly requires no introduction. Dr. Anthony Fauci is here. He has just published a memoir. It's called Encore, A Doctor's Journey into Public Service. Good to see you again, Dr. Fauci. It's not many books that I read. In fact, it's no books that I read where I get to the acknowledgments, and in back-to-back sentences, there's a thank you to Bono and to Dick Cheney. Explain.
Well, I think that's the tenure of the book, that I'm really have tried to be in the 54 years I've been at the NIH and the almost 40 years that I've been the director of the Institute, to just stick with the science and to be completely apolitical in every respect. And the Cheney thank you was the fact that the Vice President Cheney was extremely helpful in putting together a biodefense program following the anthrax attack. And I put a lot of effort into that biodefense program, which actually led to the program to to respond to emerging infections. And Bono, on the other hand, has been a very good friend over years because of his advocacy for HIV/AIDS support. So those are people on both sides of the ideological spectrum that I had felt very comfortable with because I never got political. I just stuck with what was important scientifically.
Take me inside Fauci Pharmacy. What do I see?
Well, you're in the middle of Brooklyn, a working class section of Brooklyn, and it's the 1940s and 50s. And my father and mother have a mom and pop shop that is the neighborhood hub for being a psychiatrist, a marriage counselor, a person that gives advice and even medication, sometimes free, to the people in the community who sometimes were struggling financially. And as I delineate in the book, I think that's where I started to get my inherent feeling of empathy for people who are struggling, as well as the importance of service to the community. I got that from my very early years in the late 1940s and early 1950s with my father and mother in that pharmacy.
At Holy Cross, you were a member of a construction gang before your final year that built a library at the Cornell Medical Center between East 68th and East 69th. And then, of course, you've had this illustrious medical career that involves that same location.
Indeed. It was what I did in the summers. Like I mentioned, my father, as generous as he was not the world's greatest businessman. So we didn't have a lot of money in the family. So I used my college summertime to work in a construction gang, and I happened to have gotten assigned to a construction gang that was building a library in the medical school that I would ultimately go to and study in that very library.
But nothing could have prepared me for the day during my fourth year when my mother came to visit me to bring me some toiletries and changes of clothing that she had washed and pressed. She told me that she felt weak and bloated and had lost her appetite. Further along in the book, I felt numb for the first time. I was thinking about my mother, both as a son and as a physician. What am I referencing?
Well, you're referencing the fact that in my fourth year in medical school, I was on the surgery rotation. My mother came to me just as you described, Michael. And when she gave those symptoms, it was very, very clear that there was something seriously wrong. And I referred her to my mentor, the person that was teaching me medicine at the time. And it turned out she had what I suspected. She had a far advanced cancer of her liver, for which she succumbed to like 7 or 8 weeks later. It was a very rapidly downhill course.
Dr. Fauci, June 5, 1981, an issue of a CDC weekly publication comes out, MMWR. I'm giving the acronym. And there's reference to an unusual form of pneumonia in 5 men who were otherwise healthy. This is your introduction to AIDS.
Indeed, it is. It was 1981. I had been at the NIH following my chief residency in medicine since 1972, and I had a very successful career. I was sitting at my desk in the early summer of 81, and I saw this extraordinarily unusual report. Curiously, why all young, otherwise prior healthy gay men? And I thought it was a fluke, Michael, until the next month in July, when another report came out now with 26 young gay men from New York, LA, and San Francisco, not only with a strange pneumonia that you only see in immune compromised people, but also strange cancer called Kaposi sarcoma and other opportunistic infections. And I was completely stunned by that and made a very monumentous decision in my own career. I decided I was going to turn away from the successful career that I had and function totally in all of my clinical and research efforts on studying this unusual disease, which turned out to be HIV/AIDS.
Why did Ronald Reagan take so long to mention AIDS?
You know, Michael, I don't know. I can't get in his head, but I think he took so long because he had around him very highly conservative people. And this was a disease among young gay men and then ultimately injection drug users and commercial sex workers. And somehow he felt he did not want to get out there and speak about that because, you know, amazingly so, it was felt to be offensive to people who are highly conservative. And he lost the opportunity to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to get people to be alert to this emerging plague, mostly among young gay men.
A president and a gentleman and a friend. You also describe this individual as possessing decency, dignity, and integrity. I had the privilege of serving in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. He offered you the directorship of the NIH and you turned him down.
I did, Michael, because he offered it to me right in the really accelerating component of the HIV/AIDS. And I was doing that full time, and I believe making progress, taking care of patients and doing research. And to his great credit, when he brought me into the Oval Office and offered me the job, I said, with all due respect, I think I can serve you and the country better by sticking with what I'm doing, predominantly focusing on infectious diseases. And as you mentioned, the gentleman that he was, he said something that I described in the book that I still remember. He said, I respected you before this, but I respect you even more now. A wonderful man.
Page 348 of your memoir, Dr. Fauci. On January 1, 2020, I was zipping up my fleece to head outside with Christine when the phone in the kitchen rang. I picked it up to find a health reporter on the line. Dr. Fauci, he said, there's something strange going on in central China. I'm hearing that a bunch of people have some kind of pneumonia. I'm wondering, have you heard anything? This is your introduction to what would become COVID.
Indeed, it was, and I reported it exactly that way. It was a reporter that actually called me up, and then the phone started ringing back and forth between the Department of HHS, the CDC, myself, and other colleagues. And over the next weeks, what emerged, as we all know and have suffered from over the last 4.5 years, was this historic and absolutely terrible, devastating pandemic of COVID.
A full code red with flashing lights and screaming alarms went off in my mind during the 4th week of January when I saw photos in a newspaper that revealed the Chinese government had erected a 1,000-bed prefabricated hospital over a few days. I was wondering, as I was reading that most important part of your book, what was the level of communication like with the Chinese? How forthcoming? How lack of candor and honesty? What attempts were you making, was our government making, to find out from them what the hell is going on?
We were trying very hard to find out what was going on. Our initial communications with the scientists in China, whom all of us have known well for decades and have done collaborative work with, we started to get information, and then all of a sudden it got shut down. And the Chinese authorities would not let the Chinese scientists communicate openly with us. The CDC wanted to go to China right away and talk with their Chinese CDC compatriots, but the authorities would not let that happen for a considerable period of time. It was just a very, very thick veil of free-flowing of information, which we would have loved to have had. In the beginning, we thought it was a virus that was not spread very effectively from person to person. And then after a week or two, we found out it was spread very effectively from person to person. And that's what I meant, Michael, when I saw in the newspaper that aerial photo of their putting up this 1,000-bed hospital. And that's when I said, oh my goodness, they're telling us it's not anything really particularly to worry about. Then why the heck are they building a hospital over a weekend when they only have a relatively small number of reported cases? That's when I knew something was really bad.
Will you answer the charge that you know exists and gets circulated that you, Dr. Fauci, played a funding role relative to gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that was ultimately ground zero, the location where it all began?
Well, China was certainly the location and Wuhan the city, but I mean, experienced virologists who know about the grant that was funded through a New York firm and then indirectly with a subaward of a mere $120,000 to do surveillance in China, which was very appropriate since that's where the first SARS came from. Those viruses that were studied, Michael, from the standpoint of what we call phylogeny or the evolutionary capability, could never turn into SARS-CoV-2 no matter what you did with them. So we keep an open mind that it certainly could have come from a lab. But the viruses that were studied under the NIH grant, those viruses, by anybody who knows anything about virology, will tell you are so far distant evolutionarily from SARS that they could not possibly have turned into SARS.
In this moment in time, do you believe it came from the lab, the wet market, both, neither?
Well, the preponderance of evidence, not on social media, the preponderance of evidence from experienced evolutionary virologists from all over the world, Australia, UK, European Union, Canada, feel that it is highly suggestive, certainly not definitive, but highly suggestive that it came from a natural occurrence from an animal to a human. Since it's not definitive, Michael, all of us have to keep an open mind as to what the origin is, but I go towards the weight of the evidence from experienced virologists, even though there are a lot of claims of certainty one way or the other, which just is not possible since we don't know for sure.
The assumption was that after months, herd immunity would be established because enough people would be infected that the outbreak would die down, thus allowing the sequestered, vulnerable individuals to re-enter society safely. Why not herd immunity? You say in the book that it's deeply flawed. And by the way, you'll remember maybe, but I gave airing on CNN and here on radio on my SiriusXM program to proponents, a number of individuals from Stanford, and you know who I'm talking about, who were saying we ought to be protecting our most vulnerable and let this thing run its course, which to a layperson such as myself made sense at the time. Why do you say that was never an option?
It was deeply, deeply flawed conceptually and practically shown to be absolutely flawed. Conceptually flawed for the following reason. How do you sequester vulnerable people? The elderly are the most vulnerable. Do you want to take, several tens and tens and tens of millions of people? And what are you going to do with them? What about people who have underlying conditions? What about people living in homes that are multi-generational? It would be impossible to do that. With regard to herd immunity, it became very clear for a while, maybe a few months to close to a half a year or so, that the immunity that you get from being infected is not durable. It doesn't last. And the virus kept on changing. You don't get herd immunity from a virus that continues to evolve and from immunity that is not very durable in its protection. And practically speaking, that's exactly what happened. So that issue of help to protect the vulnerable and let it rip through society would have resulted in, I believe, maybe millions of more deaths. So I completely reject that.
We had a phone segment here recently within the last 2 weeks, Dr. Fauci, where, and I don't remember what brought it on, but I ended up asking the audience, what would you do differently if, God forbid, we faced what we faced in March of 2020, if we were to face it in the future? It was a very interesting call segment. You'll be interested to know as well that on June the 5th of this month, we had a vote of confidence on Dr. Anthony Fauci. Yay or nay? 31,973 votes cast. 86.41% gave you a yay vote. That's pretty damn good. The presidents and politicians wish they had that kind of job approval. But I want to ask you the question that I asked the audience that day. Looking back, give me something you'd do differently with the hindsight of the passage of time.
Well, since none of us are perfect, there were certainly many things we would have done differently. One of the issues, Michael, is that when you're dealing with a moving target, you have to make decisions based on the information that you have at the time. If we had known early on about aerosolized transmission, about asymptomatic transmission, we would have done things differently. Number two, when you look at what we did, which was necessary to put a halt to things, at least temporarily, we would have done that over again. But the duration of the time that schools were closed, you might remember, Michael, and you could go back and check on YouTube, that after a few months, I kept on saying, let's open the schools as quickly and as safely as we possibly can. To have closed the schools in some districts, some states, some regions, for the length of time that it was closed, we know now that there are collateral negative effects of that. So we got to keep that in mind. But I think the most important thing, Michael, if there ever was a time when you did not want to have a devastating pandemic, it was at a time of profound divisiveness in our country, where people were avoiding good sense public health measures purely on ideological grounds. And we were fighting ideologically with each other rather than realizing the virus was the common enemy. So how could it be in our country that if you live in a red state and are undervaccinated, you have a greater chance of hospitalization and death than if you live in a blue state and have a high rate of vaccination? From a public health standpoint, Michael, that's very painful to me as a physician who takes care of patients, that people would choose to put themselves at risk of dying based on ideological considerations. I just don't get that.
I understand entirely that we know so much today that, of course, we didn't know in real time then. I have to say, even then, I was so concerned at what was being. I was paying 3 tuitions at the time. And those sons will never get back what they lost from their school experiences. One of them, a freshman, March of his freshman year, and doesn't return until he's a junior. And I guess the one criticism that I have, many criticisms, but one that comes to mind is I think that we erred on the side of protecting physical health and didn't give due consideration to the emotional and social development toll that was being taken by having everybody in a lockdown, which is why I go back to, again, as a layperson, the herd immunity idea. Why couldn't only those who were afflicted with comorbidities and the elderly and so forth, why couldn't they be the isolated ones instead of all of society?
But Michael, I take your point about the collateral effect on school children, and that's one of the things in lessons learned we should have examined. But I get back to what I said. It would be physically impossible to sequester all of the so-called vulnerable people. You just can't do that practically. So if you could, which you can't, then you would consider it. But on the other side of that coin, since we were never able to handle or develop herd immunity, that would have been a fool's errand to begin with, because there was no herd immunity. I've been vaccinated 7 times and infected twice. So talk about herd immunity. If you had measles, you would be protected for the rest of your life against reinfection. If you were vaccinated with measles, you would be protected essentially for the rest of your life, because measles doesn't change from month to month and year to year. COVID, SARS-CoV-2, had multiple variants over the years. So you can forget about herd immunity in its classical sense.
Dr. Fauci, he loves me not. I'm not giving the book away for free, by the way. The book is titled On Call, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service. But obviously, you go deep into your relationship with former President Donald Trump. I found it interesting, despite what was playing itself out publicly, the times that he would come to you mano a mano and just say, as like almost an old school thing that I would say with friends that I went to school with, Anthony, are we good? Right? I mean, at different times, it had all its peaks and valleys.
It did, and that's what I tried to describe as accurately as possible. It was a complicated relationship because we got along very well in the beginning. And I don't know the reason, probably, I describe it as maybe two guys from New York City.
Right.
One from Queens, one from
Brooklyn, right.
Who just felt that comfort with each other. It was a good relationship. Things only went sour, Michael, when I found it necessary, because of my responsibility as a physician, a scientist, and a public health person, to have to publicly contradict him when he was saying things that were just not true, like it would disappear like magic, or like hydroxychloroquine is going to be the cure-all for it. I could not stand there and have him say something and fulfill my obligation to the American public. That's when things started to go bad. But Michael, getting back to love me not, he wasn't okay with that, but he didn't hate me because of that. His staff around him started to try very hard to discredit me when I started to do that. He was good with me right up until the end. And he said that, "Are we good, Anthony? Are we good?"
What role, if any, are you going to play in this campaign? Are you going to speak out more than you do in the pages of On Call?
No, I am not going to be involved in a political campaign. I have stayed apolitical for the 7 presidents that I have had the privilege of advising. And I've never been a political person. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I mean, I'm just a scientist in a public health service. So I'm not going to get involved in any way in politics.
Okay, so there's not going to be a commercial in the next 5 months. I'm Anthony Fauci and I endorse Joe Biden.
No, I don't do that. I never have and I won't.
Final question. You've been in a lot of different interviews recently pertaining to the book. What is in the 400 or so pages of this book that you think that's really a nugget that I revealed, or a special story that I've shared for the first time that nobody has asked you about? Is there an aspect of this book that you think is being overlooked by interviewers, including myself?
No, I don't think there's a single aspect there, Michael, but some interviews like to focus purely on the thing that is juicy to some. The 1 year in the White House that I had with Trump. That's 1 out of 54 years. It starts when I was born in Brooklyn,
right,
83 years ago. So 1 out of 83 years was my relationship directly with Trump. And I wrote the book not as a COVID book, but as a memoir of my life to hopefully inspire young people to get involved in the wonderful life, if you want it, of public service, and hence the title, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service.
Dr. Fauci, I wish you good things. The book is called On Call, and I appreciate your being here.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, ladies and gentlemen. On Call, A Doctor's Journey in Public Service.